Well, I had a blast in my breakout room. I hope you guys did too. We just chatted and came up with some brilliant answers to the question already. So, but we will share that, I don't know when, after in the member meeting. All right, it is my great pleasure now to, and I'm so nervous that I can't think of who's next. Is it, it's Nick. Nick Nielsen from Portland, Oregon, who I met in Milan, who's a science communicator and writes in Medium. Off you go.
Okay, I guess I do this. I don't have my screen sharing yet enabled.
Okay, so Heath, you there?
No pickup today, Thursday, because of the weather.
Oh, somebody needs to mute.
Yeah.
We're hearing your personal conversation.
Also, we can park our cars in back of the lumens.
Nick, I'm working on getting you rights. Give me just a second.
No problem.
Hi, Jennifer. I hadn't seen you yet.
Okay, Nick, I just made you a co-host. You should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. And go. Share. And.
Okay. Looks like your screen sharing. Okay, I see PowerPoint. It's not in presentation mode, but I see PowerPoint.
Let me get there. Okay.
Perfect. All right. I'm going back on mute.
Thank you so much, Heath. And thank you, Lucy. My name is Nick Nielsen. I'm going to talk about scientific approaches to civilization and why that matters to big history. So I often like to observe that civilization is the largest, the longest lived, and the most complex institution of all human institutions, but we don't know what it is and we don't know how it works. So the bad news is that there's no scholarly consensus on definitions, concepts, theories, and models for civilization. But the good news is that there are many schools of thought, and we have something that we can learn from all of these schools of thought. So I am going to go through a variety of ways that people have explicitly used the concept of civilization, and at the end, I will suggest how these bear upon a big history conception of civilization. So I'm going to go through historiographical, social science approaches, which will include both sociological and anthropological approaches, archaeological approaches, and the approach we find in SETI research, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So first, with historiographical approaches to civilization, I'm going to start talking about two very well-known historians that nobody disputes their value as historians, and I'm going to talk about two people who are relative outsiders. So everybody has heard of Edward Gibbon, who wrote a very long book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He doesn't call it the history of a civilization, but we can say that Gibbon's Decline and Fall is a long delay, to use a term from Fernand Braudel for talking about long expanses of time. It's a long delay study, or a longitudinal study of Roman civilization. And he doesn't just tell the story of Roman civilization, he maintains a thesis on Roman civilization. So the whole book is, like Darwin called his Origins of Species, one long argument. And he said in a famous passage, as has been quoted many times, "I have described the triumph of barbarism and religion." So for Gibbon, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was due to the invasions of barbarians and the rise of Christianity. And by maintaining that thesis, he started a scholarly dialogue. So people responded to Gibbon. And most famously, in the early 20th century, Henri Pirenne, a Belgian historian, wrote several books in which he maintained what's come to be known as the Pirenne thesis, which is that the collapse of Rome was not about the triumph of barbarism and religion. It was about the rise of Islam, which cut off Western civilization, or what was to become Western civilization, from its origins in the Near East. And so Pirenne said, quote, "Without Islam, the Frankish Empire probably never would have existed, and Charlemagne without Mohammed would have been inconceivable," unquote. So there's Gibbon is giving us this big picture view of Roman civilization that extends from the 2nd century AD all the way to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So about 1,200 years of time he takes in discussing one civilization. So later on in the 19th century, we get a very different kind of history, but it's still a history of civilization, although Jakob Burckhardt did not use the term in German for civilization, for the culture, for his title of his book that's come to be known in English as The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. But essentially, it's instead of like Gibbon talking about 1,200 years of time, Burckhardt focuses in on what in an order of magnitude less time than what Gibbon takes in. So whereas Fernand Braudel talked about the longue durée, he also talked about the conjuncture. And a conjuncture is a unit of time that's a little less than a generation, like 10 to 30 years. And that's what Burckhardt takes. He just focuses on this particular period of the Renaissance in Italy, and he gives us what has subsequently been called a thick description of that civilization. The thick description term is due to English philosopher Gilbert Ryle, and then it was taken up by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. So we've got these contrasting views of civilization. We've got Gibbon giving us this huge span of 1,200 years, and we've got Jakob Burckhardt giving us this focused, like 10 to 20 years of the best years of the Renaissance to give us a picture of civilization. So no one disputes the historical importance of Gibbon and Jakob Burckhardt as historians, but two people who were at least as influential, if not more influential, but who were outsiders to the profession of historiography, were Oswald Spengler, for one. Oswald Spengler was a school teacher in a small town in Germany, and just before the end of the First World War, I think it was the summer of 1918, he published the first of 2 volumes of Der Untergang des Abendlandes, which was usually translated as The Decline of the West. And Spengler so perfectly captured the moment of history, the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist, if you will, that he almost instantly became a celebrity, even though the book is very difficult. It's long. It's your typical academic German treatise. It's not easy. It's not an easy read. But Spengler accomplished something that no one else accomplished, which is he got everybody talking about the same thing. So he wrote a book about civilization, and everybody talked about it. I have found references to Spengler in what was my list here? Bertrand Russell, R.G. Collingwood, Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, Otto Neurath, Walter Bonnemann, Isaiah Berlin, Theodor Adorno, and many others, some of whom I will mention later. But they all ended up talking about Spengler's book. So Spengler didn't really create what Imre Lakatos called a scientific research program. It's not something that drew people in so they could talk about it and discuss it and build on the concept, but it was still enormously influential. So just for a really, 1 or 2 sentence recap of what Spengler was saying, was that there's this undifferentiated mass of humanity, and every once in a while, a group will rise up and create a culture. And then if that culture is successful, it will attain great heights. And it's only when it's turned and it's begun its decline that it becomes a civilization. So for Spengler, a civilization was a culture already in decline on its way to decadence and extinction. And that caught the spirit of the times. That Europe had just come through this horrible First World War, which it resulted in enormous death and destruction. And that made him briefly famous. But he was an outsider to academia. And most historians and even philosophers of history give very little account to Spengler. He's still an outsider. He's always had his readers ever since he published, but they've always never been a mainstream scholarly approach to civilization or to history. So our other outsider of a kind is Arnold Toynbee, who wrote this enormous 12-volume work called A Study of History, where he doesn't just like, Spengler gives us a big picture idea of civilization. What Toynbee wants to do is he wants to give a big picture of all civilizations. So he starts and he gives what he a list of 21 or 23 civilizations. He's ambiguous on the point because the way he counts it is not exactly clear. But he does try to give a complete, total view of civilization. But it's interesting to observe that despite all Toynbee talks about civilization, and he's become important in civilization studies because he talks explicitly about the concept of civilization, still, he's a historian. And he says early in the first volume that the point of his work is that civilization is the proper unit of study for history. So what he's not saying is that history is the proper unit for the proper way to study civilization. So he's still an historian. He's still trying to study history, but he's studying history by way of civilization, which he believes to be the appropriate way to approach history. So once again, like Spengler, Toynbee is something of an outsider. Professional historians were extremely critical of Toynbee. There's a small handful of philosophers of history who continue to reference Toynbee. So like Spengler, he's always had his readers. He always will have his readers, but he hasn't really been part of the mainstream scholarly conversation. So at the same time that we have this growth of what we could call the humanistic tradition in historiography, from Gibbon through Burckhardt and Spengler and Toynbee, parallel to this, at the same time in Western history, we have the growth of scientific historiography. So this picture on the screen, this is James Hutton, who's often known as the father of scientific geology. Hutton isn't much read these days because he was not a good author, but he was one of the first people to be very clearly aware of what we now call deep time, that the age of the earth was much, much older than anyone had suspected earlier. And there's some passages in his book, which, like I said, it's not really good reading, but there's still some passages that are great and make people aware of deep time. This is William Smith. If you've ever read or heard of the book, The Map That Changed the World by Simon Winchester, it's about him. He was the first person to make a stratigraphic map of England. He was a practical man who was a builder of canals. And because he dug through so many layers of rock in his career, he began to understand something distinctive about the layers and the strata. People called him at the time Strata Smith because he always talked about the strata he dug through. He posited what he called the principle of faunal succession. And this is before Darwin. So he realized that each distinctive strata had distinctive fossils in it. And he came to realize that if somebody just showed him the fossils, he could say, okay, I know what strata this comes from because it's completely predictable on the basis of the principle of faunal succession that this strata has this life and this other strata has this other life. And this was an important moment in scientific geology. And then Charles Lyell, who wrote a huge book, a 3-volume work called The Principles of Geology, most known for its advocacy of uniformitarianism, which is usually summarized as the present is key to the past because we look at, processes in the present to predict the processes that were also going on in the past. And then Charles Darwin brought the idea of deep time to biology with The Origin of Species, and once again opened people's eyes to how old life on Earth is, which previously we didn't even have the conception of this kind of geological scale and biological time of scale of time before the work of people like Hutton and Lyell and Darwin. Then in the late 19th century, the pace picks up even quicker. And we get even more precise methods and methods that can become the basis of a scientific research problem because one person gets the idea and other people pick it up and say, wow, we can run with this. And so we get varve chronology. Varves are the layers that are laid down by glaciers, which is when glaciers melt, they melt more in the summer and less in the winter. So there's a regular annual accumulation of varve layers. That was the work of Gerard de Guer in the late 19th century. And then we have dendrochronology, which is sequencing tree rings, which you get overlapping pieces. And once you have a dendrochronological sequence, if you find, say, an axe with a wooden handle, and you can take a core of that wooden handle, if you've got an exhaustive dendrochronological sequence, you can date that axe exactly in time, even if there's no other, if you just find the axe and is in no archaeological context, you can still date it. We have the ice cores. People go into very cold parts of the world. They dig into the cryosphere, and you can bring up ice cores that have been laid down by annual depositions of ice and snow for thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And nuclear dating. The most famous, most well-known form of nuclear dating is carbon-14 uptake. And there's been a very fascinating interaction between nuclear dating techniques and dendrochronological techniques, because when carbon-14 dating was first invented, it created this time scale into the past, but then researchers were able to compare the dendrochronological record to the carbon-14 record, and they realized that carbon-14 uptake has not been consistent over the past millions of years, but it's changed a little bit as environmental conditions change, climatological conditions change, atmospheric conditions change. So when you see a date that says carbon-14 corrected, or there's other terminology, it means it's been revised and updated to reflect the interaction with dendrochronological dating methods. And David Christian called this the chronometric revolution. We have these precise scientific methods for determining timescales and sequences in history. And what this has meant is that we not only have the written record to rely on. Prior to scientific historiography, we had only the texts that had been written for the past 5,000 years. After that, we've got all these tools that we can use to extract dates and extrapolate histories that were never written. And this has been very important for big history because big history is number one, it's in the tradition of scientific historiography, but it also is in the tradition of humanistic. We want to bring together the humanistic history and the scientific history into one grand narrative, which is the entire story of time from the origins of the universe to its distant futurity. So we want to unify the natural sciences, the social sciences, the historical sciences, and we want to draw on the special sciences in an interdisciplinary way to understand what we're doing. And we want to have this one overarching narrative of increasing emergent complexity, at least up to our own time. We don't know how far we can project that increasing emergent complexity into the future. So first, to review a specific concept of civilization or cluster of concepts, we're going to talk about the archaeological approach to civilization. Archaeology becomes immediately a part of this scientific historiography because it is relying on material culture. There's on the screen, there's a definition of material culture from Barbara Ann Kipfer's Encyclopedic Dictionary of Archaeology. So it's a very useful work, by the way. So when you have the techniques of the chronometric revolution at your hands, and you have the method, and all the, I didn't talk about all the years, the decades, the centuries of work on refining archaeological methods, so you know how to take things out of the ground to retain their context. But this has all been contributed greatly to the scientific knowledge of the past and those cultures who never developed written languages and never had written their own histories. We have to write those histories ex post facto on the basis of their material culture because they didn't leave records. So once archaeologists started digging stuff out of the ground, they had to decide how they were going to display it in museums. So the guy on the screen now is Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, who was from Denmark. He ran a museum in Copenhagen, and he is the one who came up with what's come to be called the three-age system. So he said there was a Stone Age, and there was a Bronze Age, and there was an Iron Age, and they're sequential. And he wanted to display the museum, the artifacts in the Copenhagen Museum according to the three-age system, which is what's come to be called a cultural evolution. It's a sequence of cultural evolution. Then Edward Tyler wrote a book called Primitive Culture, in which he took this idea much farther, and he developed a detailed sequence of technological developments. And then we had this idea was further developed by Lewis Henry Morgan in his 1877 book, Ancient Society. But the most famous reader of Tyler and Morgan was Karl Marx. And Marx, even though Marx wrote very little specifically about civilization, he was enormously influential. And he produced a cultural evolution sequence that probably everyone has heard of, where we go from primitive communism to the ancient mode of production, which involves slavery, to the feudal mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, the communist mode of production. So that was, Marx's influence was extremely important. It remains extremely important, but it's not the only extremely important. And there's been tensions over the period of scientific historiography and humanistic historiography, for that matter, between different undercurrents of ideas. And the great, the bête noire, if we will, of Marx was Franz Boas, who was came from the anthropological tradition, did a lot of field work in northern Alaska with the native peoples there. And Boas was dead set against cultural evolution. And his influence has been in tension with Marx's influence, who was often taken as an advocate of cultural evolution. So Boas wrote an essay in 1887 that was very influential. Well, he was also, like Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, he was interested in museum displays. And he wrote in his essay, quote, "It is my opinion that the main object of ethnological collections should be the dissemination of the fact that civilization is not something absolute, but that it is relative, and that our ideas and conceptions are true only so far as civilization goes. I believe that this object can be accomplished only by the tribal arrangement of collections," unquote. So as Christian Jørgensen Thomsen wanted to arrange things by an evolutionary succession, Franz Boas wanted to arrange museums in tribal collections. So you go in the door of museums and it'd be this tribe and the other tribe and the third tribe, and their artifacts would be kept together. And this Boasian position is often known as either cultural relativism or historical particularism. Like I said, these two continue to be highly influential. So the man who you could say most made prehistory a respectable scholarly discipline was V. Gordon Childe. He's the guy in the middle wearing the tie and the vest. He was involved in, I think this is a picture from Skara Brae in the British Islands, where they excavated a Neolithic village. And Childe was himself a Marxist, but he was also a great scholar, and his books are still very readable. They're an excellent introduction to prehistory, and his Marxism doesn't really come into his exposition, but it was always in the back of his thoughts. So Childe went looking for revolutions in prehistory, and he wrote this very famous paper that was published in the Town Planning Review called the Urban Revolution. So he posited these 10 diagnostic properties of civilization in his urban planning paper on the Urban Revolution. And this has had an enormous influence in archaeological thought. You can find dozens, probably hundreds of papers. You have almost every textbook on archaeology will have a section on child, and they usually also mention what's come to be called the 10-point model of the things that distinguish the urban revolution. Your bigger settlements, the use of writing, the presence of monumental architecture, all of these things. Fee Gordon Child actually did start out what could be called a scientific research program, because many other people, like I said, this very common idea in archaeology, people have taken it up, they have changed it, they've said, no, it's not these 10, it's this other. Some people say you have to be able to wage war in order to be called a civilization. So, but it's been enormously influential. So archaeologists, like I said earlier, have explicitly discussed civilization, and in a way that a lot of other disciplines haven't. And they have come up with a lot of theories of the origins of civilization, because they're dealing with the early period of time when civilizations were originating. So we have Child urban revolution thesis, James Breasted's fertile crescent hypothesis, which the idea of the river floodplains have a great ecological potential that allows civilization to arise. Kurt Wittfogel's hydraulic bureaucracies, in which irrigation agriculture plays the crucial role in the rise of civilization. Or Robert Carneiro's coercive theory, which is takes waging war as a crucial moment. Norman Yoffe on state power increasing social complexity. Some of these theories are highly specific. Michael Mosley's theory of the maritime origins of Andean civilization does not attempt to address the origins of civilization in China or India or Mesopotamia. He's only talking about the Andes, but it's an interesting idea. And more recently, we have multivariant theories, most famously represented by Kent Flannery, which is just many, we're not saying it's just warfare or just hydraulic bureaucracies or just the ecological potential of river floodplains, but there all of these and many other elements come into play. So there's been this very extensive discussion of the origins of civilization in archaeology. So now we make a sudden shift over to social science approaches to civilization, and I'm going to divide this into the anthropological approach and the sociological approach. And interestingly, in the 20th century, the anthropological approach really dominated. And you will remember that I said earlier that Franz Boas was an anthropologist. And if you read the list of students of Franz Boas, they read like a who's who of early 20th century intellectual life. He was enormously influential. One of his students and colleagues was Ruth Benedict, who wrote a book called Patterns of Culture in 1934. And Boas wrote an introduction to that. Margaret Mead wrote a preface to that. So obviously she was very well connected with these influential figures. And here's another surprise, is that despite her influence of Boas, she discusses Spengler in the 3rd chapter of this book. And she says what Spengler was doing was actually interesting. Spengler, I should say, is come to be thought of as a representative of cultural evolution, which is at loggerheads with the Boasian cultural relativism. So Ruth Benedict says what Spengler was doing is interesting, but Western civilization is too intricate and too complex. So we have to go back to simpler models. And so she has 3 chapters devoted to the Pueblos of New Mexico, the Dobo of Papua New Guinea, and the Kwakiutl of the Northwest Pacific Coast, where she analyzes these societies in detail to try to bring out the social institutions and the distinctiveness. So once again, you get this Boasian influence of historical particularism, because she really wants to bring out what is distinctive in these groups and show how different they are.
Nick, if I can chime in, you've got 10 minutes left. I just wanted to give you a timestamp.
Thank you for the timestamp. So in the middle of the 20th century, we have the influential figure of Robert Redfield and Milton Singer. I'm going to abbreviate this a bit. I would like to talk more about it, but there was a project at the University of Chicago in the middle of the 20th century called the Comparative Civilizations Project that they were both involved in. And Robert Redfield came up with the idea called the distinction called the great tradition and the little tradition. The little tradition is the culture of agricultural villages where people have beliefs and spiritual practices and folk ideas. The great tradition is the elaborate things that you find evolving in cities that you don't find in small villages, where you get monumental architecture, you get written books, you get a detailed theology in the case of a religion. So you've got this tension and also interaction between the great tradition and the little tradition. Another figure that's interesting to me is Peter Farb, who took what was critical of Ruth Benedict, but took what she was doing and he applied it to all the native peoples who were found in North America and said, you know, we can examine all these for different stages of social development. So even though he's critical of Ruth Benedict, he's taking her project and taking it forward, where she said, it's one of the philosophical justifications for the study of primitive people that the facts of similar culture may make clear social facts that are otherwise baffling and not open to demonstration. This is nowhere more true than in the matter of the fundamental and distinctive cultural configurations that pattern existence and condition thoughts and emotions of the individuals who participate in those cultures. In the sociological tradition, we have Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss wrote an interesting paper. It's very short, just a few pages, in 1913 on the concept of civilization. But the most influential person is Shmuel Eisenstadt, who wrote several books on explicitly dealing with the concept of civilization in a sociological context. Because he's coming from sociology, his bibliographies of his papers are completely different than the anthropologists. There's virtually very little in common. And he also brings in different philosophical influences. He often references Karl Jasper's axial age, which is the idea that 2,500 years ago, in about the middle of the first millennium BC, there was an ethical and moral shift in peoples that occurred all throughout, at least in the old world. So the SETI approach to civilization, in 1957, we get Sputnik, and we get the origins of the space age. And just 2 years after that happened, Giuseppe Cassone and Philip Morrison wrote their paper on searching for interstellar communications. And then we have the figure of Frank Drake, who within a year after Cassone and Morrison wrote their paper, he conducted Project Ozma, which was to listen for radio signals from other stars. And Drake is the one who is responsible for the Drake equation, which explicitly tries to calculate the number of civilizations. Once again, we have an explicit use of the concept of civilization here. The number of civilizations in the Milky Way, the fraction of civilizations that develop technology, the length of life that such civilizations can expect. One of the most influential people in talking about civilization from a SETI point of view is Nikolai Kardashev. Kardashev wrote a very influential paper in 1964 in which he divided up types of civilization. People talk about this all the time. Then you get, just a couple years after that, 1966, I.F. Shklovsky and Carl Sagan. Shklovsky wrote a book that Carl Sagan then greatly elaborated on for the English language edition. This has a real resonance for big history because this tells the story of the whole of cosmological history up to the development of civilizations, but not from an anthropocentric perspective because they're trying to cast things in a completely general way. So with SETI, you have a lot of discussions of the end of civilization. And Sebastian von Horner wrote a paper in 1961 in which he formulated the end of civilizations in terms of the L in the Drake equation, the length of life. So he posited these different rates of, whether we would survive 200 years or 50 years or 10,000 years or 100,000 years. And there was a recent paper called The Observational Signatures of Self-Destructive Civilization, which mapped out several ways that civilization might end. And so when we think of these different approaches, the archaeological, the anthropological, the sociological, and the SETI approaches, what we've got here is the anthropologists talk about the past of civilization very roughly, as do the anthropologists and the anthropologists and archaeologists mostly talk about the past. The social science people and sociology tend to talk about civilization in the present. And SETI forecasts what might happen to civilization in the future. But as big historians, we want to be able to say, we want to have a concept of civilization that bridges all of these. We want to go past, present, future, and bring them all into one context. So I've talked about these 5 things here. They all can contribute to civilization. We can think of this in an interdisciplinary sense, where civilization is taught by people from these specialties coming in. But we can also think of this in terms of creating a new specialization for civilization that takes its influences from history, archaeology, anthropology, sociology, and SETI, and creates a new specialization. And with a new specialization, then if we come to this big history timeline that's probably familiar to all of us, you bring in the cosmologists to talk about the first 3 thresholds maybe, and you bring in the earth sciences people to talk about the earth and its complex systems. You bring in biology and the life sciences to talk about life, anthropology to talk about the origins of human beings and the distinctive properties like collective learning. Then you bring in civilization specialists to talk about the origins of civilization, its development in the present, and its possible futures. And then, of course, there's, the 9th threshold of the unknown of what comes next. So I have probably taken more than my time, and I abbreviated a bit, but I hope it made some sense. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Nick. I couldn't unmute myself. Fantastic.
Well,
a scholarly synthesis of this whole, I was thinking human ecology is what is the course that we were talking about 3 hours ago, and civilization is another way of looking at it. And this is this desperately missing piece to our curriculum. So bravo.